أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله.
Hello, welcome to another Islam in Focus program. Assalamu alaikum, peace be unto you. Today we continue with our second program in our new series, our 10th in the series of programs on Islam. Our new series, of course, dealing with the sources of Islam. Today we'll be dealing with the topic of authorship of the Quran. I'm your host, Hamid Rashid, and I have joining me on the program as usual, Dr. Jamal Badawi of St. Mary's University. Brother Jamal, assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum assalam wa rahmatullah.
Could I have you very quickly summarize the main points that we touched on in our first program in our new series dealing with the sources of Islam?
Okay. We began first by some preliminary remarks as to how the series connect with the previous series that we had before in this program. A sort of overview of the possible topics that come under the broader title of Sources of Islam. And then we began some basic questions such as the term Quran itself used to be referred to as Quran, but the more accurate enunciation is Quran. What does it mean? Where does it come from? That's from recitation or reading. And we discussed also some of the other names of the Quran that appear in the Quran itself, like the book, Al-Kitab, Al-Furqan, the criterion that's between right and wrong, and the significance of these names in expressing the nature of the Quran. We discussed briefly also how the Quran, as the word of Allah or God, differ from Hadith, which is the prophetic sayings, and we tried to classify them and explain, and mainly the issue pertaining to the fact that the Quran is a revelation both in meaning and words, so the words are dictated to the Prophet verbatim, unlike Hadith, which has some difference from the Quran. And we indicated that the fact that the Quran is revealed verbatim, word for word, or dictated to Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, does not mean that his role was simply just like a tape recorder conveying this message, because his role included, among other things, understanding, communicating the Quran, applying the Quran in his own personal life, applying the meaning of the Quran in the life of the community, and in a way exemplifying and interpreting the Quran for the people. So his role, as was described by his wife, that he was a living Quran. In fact, not just a book that is being given to the believers, it is a book and a model also as to how that book becomes a reality in the lives of the people.
Well, now, turning to today's topic, we've talked a bit about the source of the Quran, but how do we know who the author of the Quran is?
Well, one of the, or some, I should say, of the very useful references in that subject, I just mentioned them by way of acknowledgement, among others, are a number of references, but unfortunately all are in Arabic. That's unfortunate for the English speaking. An excellent book written by Dr. Muhammad Abdullah Draz called the An-Naba' al-Azim. There are also writing on the subject by Rashid Rida, Al-Wahy al-Muhammadi, by Muhammad Lutfi Jum'a, Thawrat al-Islam wa Batal al-Anbiya. There is, however, a humble little booklet that was published by the Islamic Society of North America. It's called Muhammad's Prophethood, an Analytical View, which touches also on this subject. This is in English. But like Dr. Draz suggests, we can start with a very simple, logical thing that everybody agrees to. Regardless whether the person is a Muslim or non-Muslim, whether he's a believer in God at all or atheist or whatever, everybody acknowledges that the Quran was recited for the first time or uttered by a man who was born in Arabia in the 6th century by the name of Muhammad, peace be upon him. I mean, there's no difference whatsoever that the Quran was uttered by Prophet Muhammad. That leaves us with the basic question that you raised. What is the source of that Quran? And it would appear that there are only three logical possibilities. One, that the Quran was actually authored by Prophet Muhammad himself, so the source of the Quran was himself. It's one possibility. Second possibility is that he was not the author of the Quran, but he learned it from someone else, so there are other human authors or authors from whom he brought that Quran. And thirdly, that the Quran did not have any human author, neither Prophet Muhammad nor any other human being, but it came from Allah or God, capital G. I hope that at least that much is a reasonable set of assumptions to start with and to start to verify. And I think it's only through a careful examination of each of these possibilities, comparison of the variety of evidence, both internal evidence as well as external evidence, that we may arrive at some reasonable conclusion as to who the author of the Quran is.
When you use the phrase internal evidence, what do you mean when you say internal evidence? Can you explain that for us?
Well, by internal evidence we mean evidence which appear in the Quran itself about its source.
Nice.
Aside from what is being said about the Quran, what does the Quran itself say about its source? Excuse me. And the essence of that internal evidence is that the Quran was not authored by Prophet Muhammad or any other human being, but that it was a direct revelation from God. Maybe some documentation, at least as far as the internal evidence is concerned, would be useful at this point. For example, the first time when Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, received the revelation, when he was meditating in the cave of Hira outside of Mecca, is that he said when Angel Gabriel came to him, he held him and then he said to him, Iqra, recite. And then he said, recite in the name of your Lord who creates. And that was the first verses or passages of the Quran revealed to the Prophet. And that's obvious from the story itself, from the wording of it. Read, it's a command given to the Prophet. He cannot be an author of that. It's something despite of himself. And that appears in chapter or Surah 96. No wonder do we find that the surahs of the Quran or units start with Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, in the name of Allah, the Beneficent, the Merciful. In the Quran also we find numerous passages which shows that the Quran did not emanate from any human source, that it came from the Creator. Examples: Tanzilun min Rabbil Alameen, that the Quran is a revelation which came down from the Lord of the worlds. 5680. وَمَا نَزَلَ مِنَ الْحَقِّ, that is the Quran which has come down in truth. 5716. تبارك الذي نزل الفرقان على عبده ليكون للعالمين نذيرا. Blessed is he, that's God, who sent down the criterion between right and wrong, which we said before is a name of the Quran, another name of the Quran, to his servant, that is Muhammad, that he may be, or it may be, the Quran, an admonition to all creatures. 25:1. إِنَّا أَنزَلْنَا إِلَيْكَ الْكِتَابَ بِالْحَقِّ لِتَحْكُمَ بَيْنَ النَّاسِ بِمَا أَرَاكَ اللَّهُ. We have indeed revealed or sent down unto you, O Muhammad, the book in truth, so that you may judge among people according to what God has shown you. And that is in 4:105. The similar citation is in 3:3. وَأَنزَلْنَا إِلَيْكَ الذِّكْرَ, and we, God, have sent down unto you, O Muhammad, the message. 1644. إِنَّا نَحْنُ نَزَّلْنَا الذِّكْرَ وَإِنَّا لَهُ لَحَافِظُونَ. It is we, that's God, who sent down the reminder, which is another name of the Quran, or the message, and we take care of preserving it. 15:9. Let me add one more passage in full. It's an interesting one. In Surah 26 in the Quran, verses 193 and 194, it describes the Quran in these terms. وإنه لتنزيل رب العالمين نزل به الروح الأمين على قلبك لتكون من المنذرين. Verily, this is, that's the Quran, is a revelation from the Lord of the worlds, which the honest spirit, a name for Angel Gabriel, which the honest spirit brought down upon your heart and mind, that you may be of those who admonish. So as far as the internal evidence from the Quran, it's so obvious, it's so much repeated, that the source emanates actually from the Creator, not from any other human authorship.
From the examination of the style of the Quran, is there, in your opinion, any indication that it's Allah or God who seems to be speaking rather than Prophet Muhammad or any other person?
The way the expressions, the way it's expressed.
Right. Yes. Right.
Well, the examination of the Quran shows that there is not even a single passage in the Quran which give any impression that the author is a human. I'm talking about the style, the way it addresses mankind. The thing that which is becomes quite evident for anyone who examines the Quran, even without any background about Islam, is to notice that the address there is from the Creator to the creatures. It's not like somebody telling a story or writing a biography. It is a direct address from the Creator to the human being. Many times it is used in the first person, that is, God speaks in the first person, and sometimes through such imperative as qul, or say, addressing or directing the Prophet to say that as a message of God. Of the first example of God speaking in the first person, it's too numerous really to list, but just I'll give you one example of that in Surah 15, Ayah 26. It talks about Allah or God creating. It said, وَلَقَدْ خَلَقْنَا الْإِنسَانِ. Indeed, or verily, we, that's God, have created the human. And by the way, notice here that the term we, when God uses to refer to himself, it does not mean plural, but as you know, in the majestical language, a king, when he speaks, he says we the king. It doesn't say I the king. So that's just a majestical language that has nothing to do with the absolute and strict oneness and uniqueness of the Creator. In 1585 it talks about, or God speaks, we created the heavens and the earth. Among the examples of the imperative, using an imperative, that is, God speaks but tells the Prophet, say such and such. If you take one of those imperatives like qul, I have counted using the concordance of the Quran about 340 places in the Quran where it uses the term qul, addressing the Prophet, asking him or commanding him, say. How could the Prophet be the author when he constantly is commanded, based on the style of the Quran, to tell the people, tell them such and such. One example of that, of course, is in chapter or surah 112, 113 and 114, the last three short surahs in the Quran. It always starts with qul, say, O Muhammad, unto mankind. But this is not the only imperative used in the Quran. Sometimes the term balligh, proclaim, utlu, recite, is given by way of command to the Prophet. For those who wish to examine that further, even though, like I said, there are so many of them. For example, Surah 15, 49, and 18, 27, there are examples of this sort of God speaking using this imperative. In other words, when you look at the style of the Quran, the way it addresses humankind, it's obvious that it's not the speech or words of any human being. The human being, in this case Prophet Muhammad, is simply a medium. He's told to tell people such and such as God may wish to convey the message to mankind.
Well, now, continuing with our examination of the internal evidence, in addition to the passages which we've already discussed, which affirm its divine source, are there any passages which clearly negate any human source of the Quran or any human authorship of the Quran?
Well, of course, I should start by saying that affirmation that the source is from the Creator is automatically or by implication a negation that comes from others. But I think the question is legitimate also in the sense of trying to explore the point further and see if there is additional evidence from that standpoint. What I understand from the question then is that are there any corroborating evidence in addition to what has been said already to show that it did not emanate from humans? The answer is definitely yes. Example of this, one of the most famous and widely quoted ayahs or passages in the Quran is the following one, which appears in Surah 17. It says,
قل إن اجتمعت الإنس والجن على أن يأتوا بمثل هذا القرآن لا يأتون بمثله ولو كان بعضهم لبعض ظهيرا.
The translation of meaning says, say, notice again the imperative, say, O Muhammad, if the whole of mankind and jinns, unseen creatures, were to gather together to produce the like of this Quran, they could not produce the like thereof, even if they backed up each other with help and support. This is one example. The second example that we can give is the Quranic response or reply to those who somehow had some doubt whether the Prophet himself had anything to do with the Quran or that he is the source of the Quran itself. And this we find in Surah 7. It says, وَإِذَا لَمْ تَأْتِهِمْ بِآيَةٍ قَالُوا لَوْلَا اجْتَبَيْتَهَا. Translation of meaning of the full passage. If you, O Muhammad, bring them not a revelation, they say, why has you not got it together? In other words, why did you put it together if you didn't receive it? Say, that is, O Muhammad, I but follow what is revealed to me from my Lord. This is nothing but lights from your Lord, and a guidance and a mercy for any who have faith. Let me add a third citation also, I hope will make the answer to the question clearer. In Surah number 10 in the Quran, in passage 15, it replies not only to those who doubt the authorship of the Prophet or think that he may be the author of the Quran, try to correct this notion, but even to those who thought that it is within his authority to even change or modify the Quran rather than to communicate it exactly as it is. As it reads in the Quran, in the original, وَإِذَا تُتْلَى عَلَيْهِمْ آيَاتُنَا بَيِّنَاتٍ قال الذين لا يرجون لقاء نأتي بقرآن غير هذا أو بدله قل ما يكون لي أن أبدله من تلقاء نفسي. Which means that when our verses or the signs, the Quran is also referred to as signs, where our signs are recited unto them, those who rest not their hope on their meeting with us say, bring us a reading or revelation other than this, or change it. So even the word change it. And then the answer comes in the Quran or directive to the Prophet, say, O Muhammad, it is not for me of my own accord to change it, that is to change the Quran. I follow only what is revealed unto me. If I were to disobey my Lord, I should myself fear the penalty of an ominous day to come. So the evidence is quite consistent in the Quran itself, not only in terms of affirmation, but also negation of any human source of the Quran.
Now, up to this point, we've had quite a thorough examination of what you've chosen to call internal evidence concerning the authorship of the Quran. I have to brush up on my pronunciation myself of Quran, long A. How about Prophet Muhammad, his own statements about the source of the Quran?
Well, to start with, let's go back to the story I mentioned earlier about the beginning of revelation when Gabriel came to him in the cave of Hira. As narrated in both Bukhari and Muslim, it was mentioned that Gabriel simply dictated the Quran to him. So that's a manifestation, again, according to the own witness of the Prophet, peace be upon him, that this is what happened to him. Something came to him and he was told to convey that message to humankind. In the collection of prophetic saying in Muslim, there is a very interesting prophetic saying. He says, no prophet among the prophets come without, or came in the past without God giving him some sign, some people call that miracle, or some kind of sign or signs which led many people to believe in him. And then he continues, the Prophet Muhammad says, and what has been given to me actually was a revelation which God has revealed unto me, and I pray and I hope to God that in the day of judgment I will have the largest of all the followers of prophets. And that's an interesting thing, because the sort of miracles or signs that were given to prophets prior to Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, were at least as reported largely to be a sort of metaphysical type of miracle, something that people can see with their own eyes and get stunned and wonder that this man or this prophet must really be truthful. But the difficulty with this is that as time goes on, only those who saw those miracles and only those who believe in those witnesses of those miracles can really come to this conclusion that this prophet was a truthful prophet. But since Prophet Muhammad was the last of all prophets and there is no one to come after him, it is very essential even in the mind of the skeptic to be able to see an outstanding, a living, existing miracle. Because a skeptic might say, all right, some people reported to have seen that, but I haven't seen it myself. So the Quran itself is the miracle or the greatest sign of the truthfulness of the Prophet. And that, again, I hope would be clarified throughout this series. In what sense? What proof is there to support this particular statement? What we see here is that what the Prophet mentioned is exactly consistent with what the Quran has been mentioned by way of internal evidence. Let me give just a couple of examples. First of all, the Quran brings to the attention of people that after all, the Prophet has lived already among his people for 40 years before he received the commission or the directive from God to act as his last prophet. And in the Quran it says, قُلْ لَوْ شَاءَ اللَّهُ مَا تَلَوْتُ عَلَيْكُمْ. It says, say, O Muhammad, to those skeptics, if God has willed, I should not have rehearsed or recited this, that is this Quran, to you, nor would he have made it known to you. A whole lifetime before this have I lived amongst you. Will you then not understand? So it shows that the Quran itself directs the Prophet actually to respond to this. One of the very interesting citations in the Quran, again teaching the Prophet how to respond to these accusations or doubts. وَمَا كُنْتَ تَتْلُو مِنْ قَبْلِهِ مِنْ كِتَابٍ وَلَا تَخُطُّهُ بِيَمِينِكَ إِذًا لَارْتَابَ الْمُبْطِلُونَ. That it says, and you, O Muhammad, was not able to recite a book before this book came to you, that this Quran, because the Prophet, as we know, was an unlettered man. He didn't know how to read or write. Nor are you able to transcribe it with your right hand. In that case, indeed, would the talkers of vanities have doubted? In other words, if the Prophet, for example, Prophet Muhammad was a highly lettered person who knew how to read or write, if he were a scholar of religion and he recited scriptures before, maybe those who are accusing him of fabricating his claim of the origin or source of the Quran could have had some grounds for doubt. But in the absence of this, it sounds like a very strange claim to think that the Prophet was actually the author. By the way, the references for this is 10:16 and 29:48. So the conclusion I'm just trying to clarify here is that the statement by the Prophet himself are in total consistency with the claims made in the Quran itself that its source is divine and not human.
Well, before we proceed with our further examination of the question of the source of the Quran, it might be helpful and useful to some of our viewers to clarify what is meant by the term revelation.
Well, just by way of cross-reference, there have been some fairly lengthy discussion of that in the second series in this program on dealing with the topic of prophethood. But I think it would be useful perhaps to highlight some of the points as they relate to this topic as well. But before doing this, two preliminary observations. First of all, we cannot fully understand the phenomenon of revelation if we insist that the only word that exists is the word of physical, tangible word. We see things with our eyes, but we can see also with our mind, and we can see with our souls as well. The fact that there is a difficulty in seeing the word which is basically unseen and unknown to us does not mean that it does not exist, to start with. Secondly, even in this age of so-called science and scientific progress, we find that there are so many things that has been proven but could not be explained totally on physical or tangible grounds, like the telepathy, like some of the dreams that come true or predict certain things to happen. It happens to different people. This you cannot explain fully on tangible basis, but again, one realizes that there is something beyond the seen world. With this introduction, the meaning of revelation, or the Arabic word for revelation, wahi, etymologically speaking, means something which is subtle and quick. But it appears in the Quran in a variety of meaning. It is mentioned, for example, in 1668 to refer to the inspiration that God gives to animals, in that case bees even, or insects, something that is taught or given to them to learn how to survive. It could refer, as in 1911, to a sign, a subtle sign without speaking, in the context of the story of Prophet Zechariah. It could also mean some kind of inspiration that God gives to a person who's not even a prophet, as in 28:7 in the story of the mother of Moses. It could also be a command to the angels, as we find in 8:12, to support the believers in the battlefield. In some cases even it could mean evil prompting, if you stick to the purely etymological meaning, evil prompting even by Satan, as we find, for example, in 6:12. But of course the most important and the highest level of revelation is that which is given to prophets and messengers of God.
Now, how do prophets receive revelation? Can you explain that for us? Is there any information on that?
Well, this is summarized in one citation in the Quran, one passage in 42:51. وَمَا كَانَ لِبَشَرٍ أَنْ يُكَلِّمَهُ اللَّهُ إِلَّا وَحْيًا. It is not befitting that God should speak to any human except by inspiration or from behind a veil, or that God may send a messenger to reveal to his servant what he wills. From that passage, it seems that there are three basic ways that a prophet can receive revelation. One is an inspiration or insight that God guides him to have the proper judgment on certain matters. Secondly, behind a veil. Veil here does not mean physical. It could be a veil of light, psychological barrier, but not direct communication. Or the third one is by sending a messenger, in that case a reference to Angel Gabriel, communicating a specific message to the Prophet.
Very quickly, which of the types of revelation was given to Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him?
He was honored by receiving all of them. First of all, he received inspiration or insight from God to guide him in the conduct of the affairs of the believers. Secondly, he talked to God also from behind a veil, again a veil of light, if you will, in the Ma'raj incident, or the night of ascension, when God directly talked to him. Even Gabriel could not go beyond that point and left the Prophet directly to communicate with God. And thirdly, he also received the revelation, at least in the form of the Quran, through the agency of Angel Gabriel, who brought the Quran word for word to him, in addition to other inspiration, of course, which we know as hadith, the inspiration of the meaning into his heart, and he used his own words to express it other than the Quran. So it is interesting to notice that while one prophet or the other might have been blessed with one or more, Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, being the last of God's messengers, was blessed by all forms of revelation.
Well, we'll have to stop at that for today. We want to thank you for watching. Join us next week when we'll continue our discussion of authorship of the Quran. Assalamu alaikum. Peace be unto you.
أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله أشهد أن محمدا